do you bring value to market fast? And in fact, the velocity element is how do you bring value to market faster than anybody else? And just to give you a sense of why this issue of value at speed is an issue, I mean, you start thinking about the just completely outsized rewards for getting to market with something value ahead of everybody else. So, you know, there are I think the three well-discussed examples, Toyota, Apple, Intel. So in the case of Intel, you know, they're just celebrating some major anniversary of Moore's Law. And you know Moore's Law, right? What's Moore's Law? Yeah.
Computing power increases exponentially
Yeah, it's exponential growth, right? It's every 2 years the speed of a microchip doubles. And when I first heard the term Moore's Law, I thought, Moore's Law, it sounds almost like a natural law. And then you think about it, it's like not really a natural law, but maybe it's descriptive. So then I started thinking, apropos of the session in here right before about big data, that someone had plotted a data cloud, done a line regression through there, and figured out that you had this exponential growth in computing speed. And it turns out that Moore's Law is not that in terms of being descriptive of a whole industry. It's actually more like an edict that Gordon Moore at one point said to everyone at Intel, the way we're going to compete in our industry, given that we can buy exactly the same machines and no better machines than anybody else, and we can buy the same silicon and other elements that go into our product, but no better than anybody else, and we can hire from exactly the same labor pools as everybody, but no better than anybody else, and we can sell into exactly the same marketplace as everybody, but no better than anybody else. The only way we're going to win consistently is if we get there first. And so Gordon Moore had this idea that if you could double the speed of microprocessors on a 2-year clip, and no one else could, you would win outsized rewards. And so for the last several decades, he's been right on that. So that's Intel. For those of you who got introduced to this stuff about quality and yield and all that stuff back in the 1980s, you always were faced with the dismissal of, well, it won't work for us. It won't work for us. Well, it won't work for you. Well, we don't make things in a repeatable fashion. We make things which are one-off. All right, well, it worked for the folks at Pratt & Whitney, which is one-off. It won't work for us because we're unionized, and you know, of course, Toyota is not unionized. It won't work for us because we're in the public sector, and they're in the private sector. And after all, everyone knows that unionized employees in the public sector really have so little incentive to do anything right. Right? That's the conventional wisdom. So here's the situation. So Paul O'Neill was the CEO of Alcoa, and he had discovered that non-Japanese unionized workers could do pretty darn good in terms of bringing value to market at speed. So he becomes Secretary of Treasury and he starts kicking around at what the government is doing. And I realized that not a single person in this room, except for maybe the young man there, will be shocked by this number. But it took the federal government 6 months to close its books each year. 6 months. And of course your reaction is, why bother, right? I mean, why bother? What's the use of that? And Paul O'Neill is pretty much a data hound. He asks exactly the same question. He says, why are we bothering? And it turns out you're required to. Because the law says and the regulations said the federal government actually has to close its books at the end of each year. And he said, well, if we're going to go to the effort to close our books at the end of each year, shouldn't we do it in such a way that it helps us? Now, I had a former professor, former colleague, who had these theories of information. And one was information only has value if it changes your behavior. It only has value if it changes your behavior. And as an aside, I once did a test on this. I started going to faculty meetings when I was a junior faculty member. And I said, am I going to do anything different at 5 o'clock than I would have done at 3:30 when the faculty meeting started? Turned out never, so I stopped going. But as far as this information has value only if it changes behavior. So Paul O'Neill goes to the Treasury and says, well, for this information to really have value, it's got to be somewhat current, right? So he starts looking at the processes at the Treasury, despite the fact that it's unionized government employees, and over the course of a year, they take the 6-month cycle time down to 3 days.
Wow.
Yeah, now at 3 days, that puts them ahead of just about every private, large private company in the country. Now, you ask the question, well, where's the value in that? And I actually said, Paul, where's the value in that? And this was his answer. He said, well, think about all the hard work by well-intentioned, hard-working people to get to 6 months. He said, well, I've just liberated 5 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. I said, well, what'd you do with that 5 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days? He said, well, I figured that if the data at the Treasury was so bad about this, it was bad about everything else, and throughout the government it was bad. And so what he did was he took those liberated resources to start creating real-time data stream into the Treasury about production at automobile companies and retail sales at clothing companies, and about credit card account behaviors at major banks. And you say, well, where's the value in that? Well, it turns out on September 12th, 2001, when everyone was predicting the demise of the American economy, Paul O'Neill and Alan Greenspan, who was chairman of the Fed at the time, were sitting there with data which was one day old, and trying to make decisions in policy, fiscal and monetary policy, based on real data, not data that was 6 months stale and inaccurate and all of that. And for whatever else you can talk about the stewardship of our government post 9/11, the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve were working off of real-time data, making decisions rather than just sort of guessing as to what was out there in the dark. So that's the case of the government. Fundamentally, the answer to how do you deliver more value to market faster than anybody else, the answer has to be simple. It has to be simple. And here's why. One, we're at MIT, and we give very simple explanations for very complex things. I mean, let people mess with what you do with those simple answers, but we give very simple answers. It's got to be simple. The other thing is, if you want to get a large organization aligned on how to hit the same target together, whether it's the several dozen guys on a football team, or the several hundred, tens of thousands in the military, or the hundreds of thousands in a very, very large organization, you got to keep it simple. Because otherwise, if you don't keep it simple, what they're doing over there and what here and here is going to be very, very different. So you got to keep it simple. And so if we start with that, it's got to be simple, and we say the difference between Diego's ability to deliver value to market and Steve's is his knowledge of what value to deliver, to your question, and how to deliver it. And it's all about learning. And we say, well, what are the basic mechanics of learning? Well, it's got to be, we got a problem, because if you don't have a problem, there's nothing to learn. And once we see a problem, we have to have some discipline in solving. And that's the lesson from Al Marico. If you have a problem, man, declare what you think's going to work so you can see how you're wrong. And when you finally have a solution, keep testing and keep testing that solution, and then spread it so other people benefit from it. Apropos robots that go into caves. And if you lead an organization, the thing you have to keep in mind is that these things do not come naturally to people. They do not come naturally to people. To Adam Rickover's example, people want to be perceived like they're a good guy, want to get along, and want to look bright. That runs counter to calling out problems and trying to solve them, because most of the attempts at solving them fail, right? And again, this is just a quick blip over to like the behavioral economists. They start thinking about, why do we have all these biases that screw us up all the time when we really should be deliberative in our thinking? And the answer is that these biases are very energy efficient heuristics to get to good answers most of the time. And even if we were once very deliberate and rational and experimental and all disciplined that way, once we get the first right answer, we go into our biases and our heuristics. So the thing is almost like an entropy issue here, a thermodynamic problem here, is that people in organizations want to avoid seeing problems and solving problems and sustaining what they've learned. It's just how we are wired. So if you want an organization which is competing on learning speed, as a leader of others, you're the one who keeps putting energy in and energy in and energy in as energy is getting exhausted doing these things. Anyway, let me just offer, it's fairly simple, it takes a lot of work, but it's better than the alternative of being really complex and also requiring a lot of work. So anyway, enjoy the rest of the day, have a nice weekend.